Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's local history presentation on Charles Wagner Hull in Washingtonville during America's Gilded Age with Dr. Richard Hull, who's familiar to many of you, I'm sure. Local author, historian, and continual scholar. He is here tonight to talk about his ancestors and some of the research he's done on them. And as always, I'd like to point out that this and our other local history presentations throughout this year are dedicated to our late village historian, Linda Standish, who passed away unfortunately in January. And we're sure that we sure believe that she would have enjoyed this presentation and would have been here in the room with us tonight. So welcome, Richard, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Moffat Library, the venerable Moffat Library of Washingtonville. If those walls could speak for what they could tell us. Well, anyway, as you probably know that Matthew has written a book recently. It's in Images of America. This is a series. This company has been going to communities all over the United States, publishing histories of towns and villages. And this is in that series. And Matthew's book is entitled Blooming Grove and Washingtonville. And it's richly illustrated. I highly recommend it. And of course, it's available in almost all the libraries, certainly around here in Orange County. The emphasis, it seems, in recent years has been on storytelling. I know Warwick has had several storytelling episodes at their library, people coming in and telling stories about their lives and how things affected their thinking and behavior and so forth. And I think it's a wonderful thing because it seems to be building a sense of community, bringing people together. These stories are shared, and it builds pride in the community, and of course also understanding of the community's history. So I think it's a very healthy trend at a time when so much of our society in America today is so polarized. I think this has the effect of bringing us all together. My own project is a project that I started back in 1962 when I was a graduate student in history at Columbia University, and my field was Africa. That's where I got my doctorate. But I was also interested in family history because just at that time, my great aunt, who was a great genealogist, passed away. She was just under 100 years of age, and here were boxes and boxes of material that she really collected but didn't do much with. So I had a challenge before me, and I have been researching my family history actually since that time, going back to the 1580s in southern England, a little hamlet called Crewkerne, not far from Stonehenge. The focus of this book that I'm writing on the Hull history is on the fathers of each generation, on their lives and their lifestyles, and someone on their spouses as well. I'm looking at family structure. I'm looking at the behavior of each Hull that led successive families, Hull families. I'm looking at that family structure as it changes and continuity in the family structure. I'm looking at their behavior, the content of their character, their avocations, as well as their vocations, and their special interests, their pastimes, their hobbies, and so forth. They've always been curious people. I have the first Hull to graduated from Oxford in the class of 1614. He focused on theology and went on and became a pastor in the Church of England. And we still have his mug that he was given. Each class member was given a mug, and they would toast each other. And so we Hulls have been toasting each other off and on from this mug for centuries now. we prize that possession. Well, he ran afoul of the Church of England. He felt that it was being falling too much under state control over the monarchy, and he was preaching against the government and against its intrusion into the church affairs, and he lost his job. And so he preached a sermon from his little church in Crewkerne and invited his congregation to join him on a voyage to America to start a new church, free of the Church of England hierarchy and the bureaucracy and so forth. So that's what they did in 1635. He rented a boat and put his congregation, not all of them, but about half of them, on that boat, and off they went with their spouses and children, and they ended up in Boston and then into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But he ran afoul of authorities there and ended up setting up a new church in a little village that he founded called Barnstable on Cape Cod. But he ran afoul of authorities there too. He was a very conscientious guy, but very loved to debate, loved to ask questions and think about new things. So he ended up going up to Maine, and his final years were spent on a little island off the coast of York, Maine, with a small congregation, mainly of fishermen from a community called Appledore in England. They're fishing for cod every year, and he had quite a congregation on that little island off the coast of Maine. Well, his son went into shipping and was quite successful, and he became a Quaker. And he eventually moved to follow the Quakers to Rhode Island, and there he settled on an island called Connecticut Island, and became very active in Jamestown, which is the town on that island. But he had he did his business just across the waterway there, several hundred yards from the island in Newport, Rhode Island. And he shipped to England, to the West Indies. He got into shipbuilding in North Carolina and would commute back and forth between North Carolina and Rhode Island, vacation in both places, and also living year round during his busy years. Then came the revolution, and the community of security and observation came to his house, knocked on his door, and asked him to sign a pledge to support the revolution. And he said, "No, I can't sign that because I'm a Quaker and I don't believe in warfare. I believe in diplomacy." And so they said, "Well, we'll give you 10 days to change your mind." Well, he didn't change his mind. They came and they took his house, they took his livestock, they burned his crops, and then they burned his ships as well, and left him with one big wagon which he could take a few possessions and his family and spouse. And so they left, and they went over to a place called Oblong, which was a Quaker utopian community near Pauling, what is now today Pauling, New York. And they settled there and became quite successful farmers. But they moved up the river in time to Marlborough and Milton, New York, just north of course, Orange County, north of Newburgh. And they were very active in the congregation there, in the Friends meeting. But they began to gravitate toward Cornwall because they liked the progressive feeling in the Cornwall meeting. However, it was a deeply fractionalized congregation. Some people felt that some people were considered themselves to be Orthodox, and they didn't want to break from old long Hallowed projects and rituals and so forth. So anyway, that's how that all came about. That's how they came into the Hudson River Valley. Now, the title of my presentation tonight is Washingtonville in America's Gilded Age. as seen through the eyes of a local resident, Charles Wagner Hull, and transcribed by his great-grandson, me, Professor Richard Hull. I was a professor for 49 years of history at New York University, but living here in Orange County with my wife and raising my family here. Well, when was the Gilded Age? Well, very briefly, the Gilded Age in American history ran from approximately the very final years of the 1860s, 67, 68, in 1870, and ended in about 1910. So that's the period that I have been focusing on. And that was the period when Charles Wagner Hull was very active in Washingtonville. He saw opportunity in Washingtonville, and he had friends there as well. That's really, those are the things that attracted him. But the Gilded Age was an age of enormous innovation, of inventions, of great prosperity, of the accumulation of large fortunes, of industrial advances, of modern capitalism, dramatic transformations in lifestyles and in mobility. Just think of the establishment of Tuxedo Park by Pierre Lorillard, who made his fortune in tobacco. And think of Mr. Clemson in Middletown, who invented the modern rotary lawnmower. Think of in really Washingtonville, David Moffett. Now, David Moffett came from a fairly prosperous and prominent family in Washingtonville, going back many, many, many decades. But Moffett left Washingtonville when he was very young, got into mining and engineering and railroad building out in, well, mainly in Colorado, and became extremely wealthy and built a huge house in Denver, Colorado, became one of the most famous leaders in Colorado in the late 19th and very early 20th century. So Moffett really made millions of dollars, and by 1895, he was buying companies for over $2.5 million. I mean, it just was very, very successful. But not far from Washingtonville, you had other families who were making fortunes in the Gilded Age. People like the Fowlers, people like the Jacques family in Washingtonville, in the beverage industry and wine since 1838. But by the 1860s and 70s, business was booming. And look at Gail Borden, just to the north of Washingtonville, the founder of the great Borden Milk Company. And he made a huge fortune. And then there were the Harrimans, just to the south of Blooming Grove, and the Morgans not far away either. And over in Newburgh, people like the Hova and the Rose families who were mass producing bricks, mainly for New York City, but also for construction right there in the city of Newburgh. This was a period of mass production because of the huge advances in machinery and a mass distribution of those products and the mass accumulation of capital. And I should also mention farming too. The output of grains, of barley, and wheat, and rye, and hay just skyrocketed from the 1870s. Those people who owned farms were making a lot of money. They were really, really doing very well. So this was the milieu in which Charles Wagner Hull was reaching adulthood. He was born, however, in 1840, just over the line, and again in Milton, New York, and he died in 1922. And he spent his life from about 1866 until his death in Washingtonville, and was very active in Washingtonville. He knew Washingtonville very well and wrote about it in a notebook, really a diary. He he was elected the town clerk of Blooming Grove in 1874 and remained and was reelected constantly term after term until 1910. And then when Washingtonville, which had been a hamlet, became an incorporated village in 1894, late 94, 1895, he was elected village clerk of Washingtonville. So he served both as village clerk of Blooming Grove and of Washingtonville. And in those days, the clerks really were the people who ran the community, the government of communities all over the country, all over Orange County, certainly. And so he got to know a lot of people, and he wrote about them, described them, and talked about the various problems and opportunities for Washingtonville and Blooming Grove. He was a dreamer and an optimist, to be sure. He had tragedy, though, at a very young age. Charles Wagner Hull's father died in 1851 when he was only 11 years old, and his grandfather died in 1858. So he didn't have the benefit of father and grandfather for very long. And even his mother died in 1861 at the age of 40. She was a very, very devout Quaker and used the term thee and thou. Thou hast a beautiful look. Let's all praise thee. So she had that terminology that was quite specific to the Quaker faith. And then Charles Wagner Hull's wife, and we'll get into her in a minute, she died in 1900. They were married in 1866. She died in 1900. They had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons. One of the sons, of course, was my grandfather. And Henrietta Van Cliff Giroux Hull died in 1900 at the age of 54. So so many members of the family were rather short-lived. Charles Wagner Hull was educated at Cornwall Collegiate School here in Orange County. It was a boarding school. It was known, interestingly, for its handwriting. That was one of the items in the curriculum. There was great importance placed on handwriting. And that's probably why Charles Wagner Hull got the job of being a clerk, because his script is beautiful. I mean, it's really artistry and vocabulary. They stress vocabulary as well, and math. But the Cornwall Collegiate School had a very, very good reputation for excellence, for educational excellence, and it went all the way through to high school. And so he was educated at Cornwall Collegiate. And of course, some students at the school came from Washingtonville. And his family, though, were still living in Milton. After school, he didn't go on to college. He, at the age of 16, he moved to New York City and worked in a dry goods store called Haviland, Lindsay and Company. And that store was owned by his cousins, his relatives, his uncle. This was a close family, in spite of these deaths that I mentioned. Very close and very extended family. Cousins, first cousins, second cousins, third cousins. They all seemed to know each other and help each other out. So he worked there. He worked there during the Civil War. He worked there during the draft riots in New York in 1861. And it was very violent, of course. And he decided that New York was just too violent, too crowded. He yearned to get back to the upstate, up the Hudson River. And so he returned and married the daughter of Elias Giroux, who was one of the most prominent farmers in Blooming Grove. His house and property still stand, and it's diagonally across from the Blooming Grove Town Hall and Police Department. And he was a prominent dairy farmer. So he married his daughter and he, as a wedding present, he offered to build a house for them just down the street. And that's what happened. He hired a fellow by the name of Charles James Burns, who was a builder and contractor and really an architect, although he didn't call himself an architect. But he was very interested in mansard roof buildings. He had a book on mansard roofs in Paris. And so he specialized in mansard roofs. And many of the houses that we see in Orange County today that were built during the Gilded Age were designed and built by Charles James Burns. And his daughter actually ended up marrying one of Charles Wagner Hull's sons, who was my grandfather again. So, so there's all of this interest, these interconnections. But then again, this was a small community. Washingtonville, when Charles Wagner Hull moved to Washingtonville in 1866, it didn't have a population of more than about 650 people, and Blooming Grove itself was a small community at the time. Well, I'll get into that later. Anyway, he was a conscientious objector. Charles Wagner Hull refused to fight in the Civil War, and based on his faith as a Quaker. And he, in those days, you had to pay though. If you weren't going to serve in the Civil War, you had to raise a considerable amount of money. I can't remember what it was, but he was able to raise that money and also claim religious reasons for not joining the military. And so he did not serve during the Civil War, but he was an abolitionist. He was a member when he was younger of a very radical pro-abolition group in Milton, based on the Milton Quaker meeting, and he so he was a verbal supporter of emancipation, and he was a Republican as a result, and the family remained Republican right down to myself actually, but he was a Republican mainly because, of course, of Abraham Lincoln, who had enormous admiration for. Okay, so he came to Washingtonville and he saw an opportunity in construction. He saw that farmers were getting prosperous, very prosperous, and they were expanding their houses. Up until this time, the average farmer lived in a little frame or stone house. Kids shared bedrooms, 3 or 4 kids to a room and so forth. They were very modest dwellings. But now suddenly money was coming in. They were selling a lot of milk, and I'll get into this again in a minute, especially milk, but other things. And so he founded the first hardware store in Washingtonville in 1876, I think it was. And that hardware store sold lumber to expand these little houses into very substantial houses, and to put tin roofs on them. So he went into the tin business as well, sold tin out of the shop, and then eventually sold insurance because the farmers now had wealth. They had big barns built for them as well. And if you travel around all around Orange County, you see these huge houses. Well, most of them were built in this period, the last 2 decades, the first decade, last 2 decades of the 19th century, the first decade of the 20th century. And many of them were signed and built by Mr. Burns, my other great grandfather. Charles Wagner Hull also went into the insurance business to insure, and one of the most reliable and largest companies was the home insurance company, founded, I think, back in the 1840s or so. And so he sold insurance, and for fun, he was a great talker. He loved to tell stories. Apparently, he was a very extroverted person, and he didn't drink, but he certainly enjoyed life at the various taverns, like Moffat's Tavern, There are a number of taverns, small and large, few hotels in Washingtonville, and then there was Halleck's, which is down by the railroad station. The railroad came to Washingtonville in 1850, and that also contributed to the prosperity of everybody. Farmers, dairy farmers especially, really make a lot of money, and ship their milk down into the New York markets by train. And this was a branch open that ran from Gray Court, which is a hamlet in Chestertown, ran through Washingtonville, through Craigville, Blooming Grove Village, Washingtonville, and onward all the way over to Newburgh and New Windsor. And so that and so Washingtonville kind of became a satellite very much of Newburgh. Newburgh began to loan money to many people in the Blooming Grove area, in Chester and elsewhere, because some of the big fortunes were being made in Newburgh. Well, as I said, Charles Wagner Hull married Henrietta Van Cleft Giroux, the daughter of Elias Giroux, and Burns built this beautiful house, and it still stands today. You'll see it just as you drive from Chester in. You're approaching Washingtonville Village, and it's just a few hundred yards from the municipal center there, the police station, and the church there on the right-hand side. And whoever owns it now has done a beautiful job of restoring the house, even though the external features had never been changed, were always quite intact and well preserved through history. It's really a very strikingly beautiful home, and I'm told, one of the first houses in Orange County to be built with a mansard, French-style mansard roof. Okay, well, he read several papers. You could buy daily newspapers in Charles Wagner Hull's hardware store, and he entertained people around his stove, and they would have discussions, breakfast sometimes, debate issues and so forth, and buy the newspapers. He himself read several papers each day, and papers are being widely read now. Literacy rates were growing rapidly in the Gilded Age. Linotype machines were being invented, and rotary presses, and so the price of newspapers was dropping. Some of them were selling for just a penny. And so everyone was buying newspapers, reading newspapers. Charles Wagner Hull was one of them. And looking at some of the papers that he read, I can see they tended to be progressive, although he was very open-minded. He was an open-minded person as well, even though he was progressive. But he loved the Newburgh Register and the Newburgh Daily News. And Newburgh had, of course, a morning newspaper and an evening newspaper right up until only about 40 years ago. He was a Mason. Charles Wagner Hull was a Mason. He was a member of the Blooming Grove Board of Health, at least from the 1890s. And what's so interesting about that is that typhoid fever was becoming a serious problem. Death rates in Blooming Grove, and especially in Washingtonville, were very high from all ages. By the turn of the century, by 1903, there had been 3 pandemics, and they carried fairly high mortality rates. So he decided to organize a board of health connected to Orange County, to the county, and served on that board of health, and put a lot of pressure on the taxpayers to build a water system, to build a water works. He didn't fund it because Charles Wagner Hull, as I said, was not a wealthy person. He didn't have much money. He wasn't really, in some respects, he wasn't an accumulator of wealth and of consumer goods. Anyway, he got involved with that, and he was interested in infrastructure. Washingtonville existed really. There was a settlement there before the Revolutionary War, but it really wasn't until 1810 with the construction of the so-called Great Court and Blooming Grove Turnpike. And that turnpike was funded by local capital, by shares of stock, and by toll booths. You had to pay initially to travel that turnpike. They had to build bridges. Washingtonville had a covered bridge. My great-grandfather proposed marriage to his wife on a covered bridge in a stormy summer afternoon. A lot went on the covered bridge. The covered bridges were being built by many of the turnpikes that were appearing, but these were initially private roads, and he was very much in favor of keeping that road in good shape so farmers could transport goods. But they had the competition, of course, of the railroad as well after, as I said, after 1850. Okay, in terms of his, and he also supported the establishment of a bank. He was a good friend of Mr. Jacques, who had owned the Brotherhood Winery. And they used to, many of the merchants, there's no bank in Washingtonville, Blooming Grove, anywhere. And they hired somebody to take their cash every week and travel over to Newburgh to a bank, I can't remember the name of the bank, to make their deposits. And Charles Wagner Hull and Jacques and a few others got together and said, hey, listen, we got to have a bank here. And so in the First National Bank, this is a state bank, First National Bank of Washingtonville was opened in 1907. And it was a huge success from the very start. It really boosted business greatly. But they needed space. They wanted to be right in the center of the village, right on the corner of Main Street, which was a turnpike, and the street that goes down to the water, to the river. And he said, look, take my building. Don't tear it down. Let's move it and build the bank on my corner lot. So Charles Wagner Hull's hardware store was moved, and it remained there until just 2 years ago when it burned down. It used to be Saturno's Hardware. They took it over many years later, of course. And the bank building got built where it is today, that stone bank right on the corner there. But that used to be where Charles Wagner, that's where he started his hardware store, his hardware business. In terms of his faith, he was a member of the Blooming Grove Congregational Church. The Giroux were very active in the Congregational Church, as was especially their daughter. And so he joined that church. And he was also very, very inspired and impressed by Reverend Hathaway. Reverend Hathaway came into Blooming Grove in 1866 and remained the pastor of that church until 1909 when he passed away. Charles Wagner Hull became the superintendent of the Sunday school and head of the so-called Youth League, and devoted a lot of his energy to that Sunday school for many years. And he just was, I think he was very much inspired by Hathaway. They got to be very close, and Hathaway had a great mind, a great intellect, tremendous amount of energy, and very progressive, I understand, in his religious thinking and practice and so forth. So Hull ditched the Quakers, and in fact, they had so-called disowned him. The Cornwall meeting disowned him because they felt that he was veering too far away from Orthodox practice. And the church was breaking apart anyway into two factions, the Hicksites and the Orthodox. So he felt it was time, and it was too far to travel over to Cornwall anyway, every Sunday morning. So that church, and of course that church still stands today, just south of Washington Village. Okay, so he was active in that. Now his pastimes, he loved music. He was a autodidact in terms of training himself for the violin. He played the violin, and he often played duos with a guy by the name of William Sparks, who was a neighbor. And Sparks played a violin as well, and a banjo, and some other musical instruments. And the two of them, for years, had gigs all over Bloomingdale, and especially at the Thrall Library, Thrall building. When that opened in 1887, they were invited to come in and have a performance. And Hull brought in his daughter, Clara. She was still very young, and she had a beautiful voice. So there were the three of them going around, traveling around on Saturday nights with gigs, or Sundays, for weddings, for funerals, for class graduations, which were held in the, and what am I saying, Thrall Library? I mean the Moffat Library, which were held in the Moffat Library from the very beginning in 1887. And so they were quite a pair. And I should maybe pause for a moment to show you a few visuals. This was his store. Over here. That was the store, which is where the bank building was located until it just closed a few years ago, of course. That was a store. Here he was, a young man, fresh out of working in New York for a number of years, clean shaven, short haircut, and modern clothing, because the dry goods store that he worked in Manhattan was a leader in the new styles and new clothing styles for young people. And America itself, at that time in the 1860s and 70s, people were beginning to dress differently. Up until that time, clothing styles, especially for men, hadn't changed much well, since the American Revolution. And he loved clothing. And often he would dress as if you would think that he was David Moffat. He was a multimillionaire. I mean, he looked very, very prosperous. But it was only because he just loved clothing and fabric and neckties and things like that. And here he was later in life. Later in life, of course, he did begin to sport a mustache, but still dressed to the nines, with cufflinks and all kinds of things. And here he is with Sparks on his banjo and Hull and his violin, performing at the Moffat Library. Probably, I don't know if it was at the opening, but not long after its opening, maybe 1890 or so. But they were very much in demand. And I don't know if they charged any money. I think they did it for free. And to be clerk of the town and the village commanded a paltry salary. I mean, I admire my great-grandfather. He was a very civic-minded guy. And I'm sure he said, oh, don't worry about the money. It's all right. It's all right. I just want to help out here and take care of the governance of the communities. And, so that's how he was. But he promoted business in Washingtonville. He was head of what you could almost call a chamber of commerce, but it wasn't called a chamber of commerce. And he and Jock and a few others, the Moffats, came out in February of 1879, Washingtonville's first newspaper, and it was called the Washingtonville Times. And here is volume 1, number 1, with all the stores, almost all the stores that were in Washingtonville at that time in 1879. And they thought this was going to be the beginning of a great era of newspapers in Washington. Well, it wasn't. This was the only issue. It didn't make it, and I'm not sure just why it didn't make it, but it was not successful. Okay, now let's see. Yes, so that's music. He liked Haydn. He liked Mendelssohn. He liked Mozart. He loved Polish music. He played to many Polish communities in the very early 1900s when he was already in the 70s. And okay, let's see. Yes, he liked Schubert. And he composed a few of his own, some of his own music. And he loved painting. He was painted pastoral landscapes and humanscapes. He would, if he went to a party or a wedding or some gathering, he would sketch scenes, watercolor mainly, but he also used a pen. And then he would give those paintings to the newlyweds or whoever was being honored. He wouldn't sell them, he'd just give them away. But he was prolific. He did hundreds of works. And unfortunately, he gave almost all of them away. We only have about maybe a dozen, not quite a dozen, 10, I think, of his works in the family. They were just distributed everywhere and kind of disappeared. But he loved nature as well. He loved hiking. He loved hunting. He painted scenes like this of animals. He loved animals. He loved plants. He loved just hiking and hunting. And he enjoyed taxidermy. He became a taxidermist. And there was a time in Washingtonville when everyone wanted some animal that they might have killed in their hunting. And he would do that kind of work. He became a taxidermist. He also loved trotting. He got to be a very good friend of Alden Goldsmith, who had a horse called Maid. And that horse became one of the fastest trotters in America in his day in the 1870s, I guess it was in the early 80s, and a great stud, and made a lot of money actually for Alden Goldsmith. He became a very wealthy man. And I think he finally sold that horse for $22,000. It's a considerable sum of money, but he made even more just in breeding Maid. Maid was famous. And farmers really loved horses, not just as beasts of burden, but to race, to take them over to Goshen, to the racetrack. They even would close off the Belleville Turnpike and have races each year, attracting people from all over Orange County. And they were in great competition with each other over their horses and their time, their racing, and many of them did break records. So this was definitely horse country, as was Chester and Goshen, of course, as well, not just Bloomingdale. So that was another thing. And he occasionally on weekends he would go out to what was called Orange Lake Amusement Park, when there was an electric trolley that was established that ran from Newburgh from 1895 until 1926, actually. And Orange Lake Amusement Park was very popular with people not just from Newburgh, but from all over the eastern part of Orange County and from New York City. The Hudson Day Line would bring up thousands of people in the summertime for the day to spend at the amusement park with all kinds of swimming, boating, and so forth. And in the winter, ice boating. That became a popular place for people who had ice boats, and many did actually. And I think people still race boats over the ice in the wintertime at Orange Lake. But that was very popular with them. So I think I'm going to stop here because we're running out of time. Some of you might have some questions, but it's been fun for me, and I've learned a lot about myself. I see a lot of myself in my ancestors, interests, their behavior, their attitude about people, about their faith, their spirit. And so it's been great to study them, and I've taken every one too since the 1580s, every one of them I have information on them. Death, their birth, their deaths, their children, names of their spouses, where they live, where they travel, what kinds of work they did, and so forth. So my legacy to my family, my two sons, who are adults now, their children will be this book. And I got to hurry because I've been retired now from New York University since 2015, and I'm in my 80s now, and I see so many of my faculty colleagues, contemporaries, and classmates from high school and college and university passing away or developing dementia and so forth, not even remembering their own names in some cases. My wife, Josephine, has been getting after me, thankfully. Get this book finished. Hurry up. Let's get going. These are our twilight years. And who knows, what you'll be like in another year or two, 5 years. So I'm busy. I'm keeping busy, and I'm really having so much fun reading letters written 150 years ago, just hearing about these people, and often saying, "Oh my God, gee, that's how I feel about this or that." So that's the whole family, and our roots go back to the Hudson River Valley deeply, as do my wife's as well. Orange County people. We like to consider ourselves Orange County. Orange County is about to grow in a huge way. Washingtonville actually experienced population decline. From the time my great-grandfather arrived, as I said, the population of Washingtonville was only 600 and something, and of the whole town was only about 2,500 people. And it remained a very rural, open community with lots of farmland until after the Second World War, when a lot of veterans came up here and built homes. Some of you may have known Professor David Hicks, who was a colleague of mine, and was stationed at Stewart during the Second World War, the air base. And when the war was over, they bought a house in Washingtonville, and he lived there until he died a few years ago. Retired from many decades of service to the city. And so Washingtonville grew quite rapidly, as many of you probably know, in the late 1950s and 60s and 70s. Many firemen, policemen, sanitation people came out here and established their families. It was within commuting distance. And now Washingtonville and Bloomingville are on the verge of another huge population explosion. Orange County now is one of the fastest growing counties in the United States. So it is imperative that we understand our legacy, our history, and try to preserve as much of it as we can. Not just its political history, but the history of farming, the history of stewardship over our land. It's a beautiful land, as you all know. That's why you're here. And we want to try to preserve as much of that as we can. And the Orange County Land Trust, I think, is spearheading that initiative to try to save as much open space, and particularly farmland and food-producing farmland in Orange County as we can. Orange County at one time, for example, was a bread basket of colonial America. Orange County grain farmers, wheat farmers exported their grain not only all over the state and into New York City, of course, but all over the world, to Morocco, to Australia, to England, elsewhere. We were global in very early times.
So Richard, I hate to cut you off there, but we have about 5 minutes left, and there's a couple of questions actually in the chat. So Heidi asks, I'm going to ask them in order. So Heidi asks, where was the covered bridge?
Well, let's see. The covered bridge, Patricia Lane, I think it's called Patricia Lane in Washingtonville, just before you get to the Moodna. There's a bridge there, of course, and then a little miniature golf course on the left. Well, that Brooks Bridge was right there at that spot, and was built in 1840, I believe, Matthew, you might want to
Yep.
verify that. 1840,
Yeah,
Brooks Bridge,
1840, 1841. Yep.
4041, and it was taken down about 26 or so?
Around 1922.
22. Yeah, that was when 1922 was when the turnpike became ultimately Route 94. And it was paved at that time. First, it was paved with bituminous tar, and then I think it was concretized in the 1920s. I
Yeah.
can't remember what's the surface now. It's tar again, isn't it? Macadam again?
Yes.
It's not concrete, is it?
And if you read, if you pick up a copy of the Images of America book, I'm not here to sell it, but if you do pick it up, our town historian Jeannie Versuevo, who's also on our library board, was very kind and provided us with some really nice images of the bridge actually being taken down. That and
That's right. You have a photo in your book of
yeah, so you can take,
or is it EJ's book? Maybe.
I think it's in mine, and I think EJ might mention it as well. Sue Ann looks like she might have a question. Sue Ann, you could unmute yourself.
It's not, oh, there we go. It was in 1997 that the wooden base of that bridge was removed because my eldest was graduating the high school that year. And so of course, the powers that be waited till the weekend of graduation to decide to close it and replace that wooden bridge. And there was another one over in front of Camp LaGuardia that was the wooden part. They didn't have the covered, but the wooden base of it. And that was in the 90s, they replaced that. With that, which was, I mean, to think that it would be lasting, that would have it up until that point in time.
Yeah, interesting.
Huh. Yeah.
But that was one of, I would really call that one of Washingtonville's landmarks. And it was one of the last covered bridges remaining in our area. There was one down in Milford, which is the Hamlin and Warwick, which survived in the 20th century. That was a famous bridge.
Yeah. So Diane now asks, where was the hardware store? We just lost our beloved Nailed It hardware store. Very sad. I believe that actually the Hull's hardware store. I'm sorry, the Hull hardware store that was, you know, basically attached to Nailed It for a brief period of time. That's now what became the parking lot of Nailed It hardware. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh.
Bravo for this presentation, by the way. I really appreciate it. My husband and I are relatively new to Orange County. We've been here about 6 years.
Oh.
And I'm anxious to hear about all the history that's here. So I very much appreciate, your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for tuning in. Orange County has a fascinating history.
Yeah.
Fascinating history. And there's a lot of material, a lot of literature available too. And genealogy too. The Orange County Genealogical Society has a wonderful collection too. We want to study the family.
Well, I'm Polish, and I'm very curious about the Polish population. In Pine Island and the Polish store there. And I love the fact that the streets are very Polish named.
Yeah.
That's another arena I would like to understand better. Yeah, but thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're quite welcome.
Yes. Sue Ann has another question.
Oh, wait a minute. Just two quick things. The house that you spoke about, that your relatives lived in, that's diagonally across from the current police station.
Yeah, that was my great grandparents' house.
All right. Well, the current owners are the sons of Guy Jones, who with Blooming Hill Farms. One of his sons lives there and bought that, which is kind of neat. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I must write that down. Guy Jones.
Guy Jones from Blooming Hill Farms. It's on 208. Yeah, it's
Blooming Hill Farm.
Yeah, Blooming Hill Farms.
Organic. It's organic.
Yes.
Oh, really?
And
Guy used to be a lawyer in the city.
yes. He was on and he moved up here. He was on the PTA. He got on the PTA at Round Hill Elementary. Then he went to the school board. One quick question. You mentioned another house that has a mansard roof. And when you're at like the police station going towards Washingtonville, is it on the right-hand side? And it's like yellowish with,
Yeah, that's the house I'm talking
that's the
about.
one, and it's got like the sunroom or the conservatory in the back.
Yeah, yeah.
Solarium, that's it?
Yeah, yeah. It's really unique. I mean, that was one of Burns's first, and
Wow.
and the architectonics of that building are really quite unique. I'm so delighted that it has been restored now. It
Mhm.
was falling into disrepair,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I was afraid somebody would come along and demolish it.
Mhm,
But from an exterior point of view, I think they've done a good job.
mhm.
And Guy Jones, do you think is the fellow who owns that house now?
No,
Guy-
no. He, his kids, one of his sons, he's got 3 sons. They run the Blooming Hill Farms now. And one of his sons bought that house that has the horse, I don't know, you can't go a horse thing, like you drive underneath, like the portico or whatever.
Oh wait, and that's actually
No, the White
Giroux
House.
The
No,
White
that-
House, the Giroux house
Well, the one
that you would drive underneath.
that was,
That's across the street.
yeah, that one, that's where one of his sons live. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the house that belonged to Elias Giroux. Yeah, and they
Oh.
were actually originally French Huguenots. They were from
Oh,
not directly though, but his 4 generations before Elias Giroux came over here from France. And
wow.
up to
Oh, wow.
this farm.
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
Fascinating, fascinating.
and you may wonder where I am. This is my own library. Years ago, I built my own building on our property just for my archive and my library. Right?
Wow, wow.
I
Neat.
It's on an old farm that my parents bought in 1949, and my brother became a grower of apples, and it's the oldest. The house on the property is the oldest house in Orange County. My brother raised his family there, operated the farm, and eventually inherited the farm. And my wife and I took a little part of it and built our own, made our own home. Became a bit of a family compound.
Well,
So we're over in Warwick.
well, I'd like to thank. I
Yes.
think we're at time now, everybody. But
Yes.
I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd like to thank you, Richard, for presenting. It was wonderful. We're going to be posting this recording to our YouTube channel in the next couple of days, so feel free to subscribe.
Oh,
And,
great. So members of the family can view this.
Yep. Everybody could view it, and it'll be on our YouTube channel as a recorded oral history, which will benefit everybody greatly. So,
Good. And your series in local history, I think that's great that you have a series.
Yep. We have lots of different programs, lots of different lectures and different aspects of our local history on there. So feel free to explore some more. But until next time, we will see you again very soon.
Thanks, man.
Take care.
Forward to it.